Greetings, namaskar to all our learners. Welcome to CEC lecture. Dear learners, the topic that we will be understanding and deliberating is Reshaping of International Relations, case study of post-Cold War situation. As we take the lecture forward, we like to tell all our learners that this will be of great use for the learners from the discipline of history, political science, international relations, international business also, because the world that we live in primarily is a post-Cold War world wherein today there are new challenges as well as new opportunities. So in this lecture, as we take the learning forward, we will understand the realm of global politics firstly with reference to the changes that have been brought in by the Cold War, and then how these changes of post when Cold War ends, this post-Cold War world, how does it impact global politics? Also, we will elaborate on the key developments with respect to the international relations, primarily looking at the phase of end of Cold War. This lecture, we will try to have some understanding on the dynamics of geopolitics, the issues that were cropped up for the world polity after the Cold War, understanding the debate between multipolar world and a bipolar world, and most important, looking at this idea of new world order that is being debated in the contemporary world frame. The Cold War ends in early 90s. What happens here is the Cold War, there was no actual war, but it was in the nature of an ideological war between the then two superpowers, USA and USSR. The Cold War had its various phases, namely the rise of Cold War, the detent and the end of Cold War. And herein what you see that amidst these phases of Cold War, one of the defining perspective was the superpower rivalry. The world was divided into a bipolar power bloc, namely the capitalist versus communist bloc. And in this, there was also a non-aligned third bloc. So what you see here is with the end of Cold War, there were changes in the foreign policy. And at the same time, the era of bipolarity, that is namely the world being divided into two power blocs, capitalist versus communist, that is United States versus USSR, that conflict got over with the dissolution of Soviet Union, disintegration of Soviet Union, collapse of communist regimes in Eastern Europe, fall of the Berlin Wall, reforms like perestroika and glasnost by Gorbachev. The world witnessed a new phase wherein in the end of the World War, world witnessed a multipolar world with new power centers. However, herein it was United States which was the dominant powers. The post-Cold War, therefore, if we are to define, we quote, it is the period after the end of the Cold War. And as discussed, Cold War was not an active war, but rather a period of geopolitical tensions. And most important that these geopolitical tensions, they were marked by ideological confrontation between two superpowers. The Cold War divided the world. We know that how the world was divided into power camps. So one was the NATO camp, primarily the US camp, then the Warsaw camp, namely the communist Russian camp, and therein the non-aligned camp, wherein countries, they did not adhere to any power politics. And superpowers at this time, the superpower game was little more dangerous because it was just not about superpower issues. It was more about the aspects of nuclear missiles. And herein superpowers resorted to confrontation and propaganda. So the period of Cold War, roughly if we go by several accounts of history, was from 1945 to 1989. And this characterized the pattern of global politics in a bipolar world with two power blocks. This also had an impact on the theorization and perspectives prevailing in understanding global realms, wherein the realist discourse, as opposed to the ideas of idealist perspective, put forward the world as a power struggle narrative, that is statism leading to self-help followed by survival. Now in this, what you see here is that there were competing power centers in Europe, in Russia, India, and also the issues of global south were put forward once the Cold War gets over. And at the same time, there was a questioning of the Eurocentric biases in putting forward understanding of the world views. Now, when we try to understand the narrative of the global south, which asks for taking into account the perspectives, the ideas and theories from the vantage point of Asia, Africa, Latin America, there was an emerging global order and also reshaping of global politics. The world was no longer about two power blocks. It was no longer also just about one superpower. Though United States always was the superpower, yet there were other superpowers like Brazil, Russia, South Africa. An example of it can be seen at G20 and at BRICS. So what one finds here is that with the narrative of global south challenging the hegemony of Eurocentric worldviews, there were questioning and reimagining of the world order. The world was still defined by anarchy. Even today, no doubt, there is an understanding that it is the national interest for any state that is supreme. States are there in international arena to secure their national interest and increase their power. However, at the same time, there is rise of other organizations also. What we see here is with the end of the First World War, there was rise of Woodrow Wilson idealism. An extension of it can be seen in the establishment of League of Nations. The League of Nations worked from 1920 to 1942. However, as accounts of history tell us and debates go forward, that how the failure of League of Nations was one of the causes for the Second World War, and one of the reasons why the League of Nations failed was perhaps even United States not joining League of Nations or its inability to impose sanctions against the aggressor. So it was argued that the League represented high point of interwar idealism. And amongst this, once the Second World War takes place, there was an argument that how member states and nations failed to act through the League when Italy was getting into aggressive mode. Similarly, conflict was almost inevitable. Therefore, it was argued that how today in the world as we go by the ideas of Hans Morgenthau, E.H. Carr, how they say that the ideas that really define international relations, it's realism, that states are here to ensure their national interests. States are rational, self-interested players. There are, of course, differences in terms of understanding the power struggle, the conflictual and competitive side of global politics from the realist to the neo-realist. The realist gives a lot of focus on the human nature in order to understand, and thereby the work of Hans Morgenthau is often called as principles of political realism, as contrasted to the work of Kenneth Walls, wherein in his theory of neo-realism they are trying to look at the structure of the international relations being defined by a principle of anarchy, that is lack of any centralizing authority. So herein what you see here is that the end of the Second World War followed by the Cold War gave an affirmation to what realism has been standing for, that is ensuring states' interest, national interest in the conflictual, competitive ambit of global politics. No doubt, United Nations existed as a post-Second World War institution. It's headquartered in the New York City, and even today there is a debate in the post-Cold War era on the need to reform the structure and the functioning of United Nations. There are 15 members in the Security Council, which consists of 5 permanent members, including USA, France, China, Russia and United Kingdom. The other 10 members are elected by the General Assembly for a period of 2 years, with each region of the globe represented on the council. Now, dear learners, we all know that the 5 permanent members have veto power and can block the action of the council. In the post-Cold War period, time and again, the issue of reform of Security Council has been raised because the context of global politics at the time of post-Second World War and beginning of the Cold War has changed now. With the changes in context, post-Cold War world has different challenges. There has been degrees of variation in the power dynamics of the countries. Countries who were superpowers at the time of the end of Second World War are perhaps not in the same degree powerful now. So therefore, with respect to issues and ensuring adequate representation with respect to issues of global politics, the issue of reform of Security Council has been put forward in post-Cold War era. Then it's also very essential that no doubt member nations of United Nations have contributed combat troops, come in a way forward for peacekeeping missions, but at the same time, it's just not states that existed in isolation. The post-Cold War world saw states being in association with non-state actors, and one of the most important impact of international organizations as a non-state actor was felt in the economic areas. We all know that how at the end of the Cold War, the Second World War, the Bretton Woods Conference was held, and at the same time to regulate global trade, GATT rounds were there. In the post-Cold War era, the World Bank, the IMF, the World Trade Organization played a very important role in management and regulation of global trade and finance in the post-Cold War era. However, today there is a debate on how the international organizations, the issue that is that they do factor in gains, namely when we look at from the neoliberal perspective that there are absolute gains, but these absolute gains are countered by the aspect that is there is a democratic deficit with respect to the functioning, the ways and manner of functioning of the international organization. An important perspective in the post-Cold War era is that of how regional organizations came up. We saw that how European Union, from till the African unity. The EU is very important here to be analyzed because at the end of the World War II, there were trade agreements within Europe over coal and steel, and then to attempts to factor in European common market, and then finally to the European Union via the Maastricht Treaty in 1993. So what we see here is that regional integration or regional organizations acquired a new framework wherein EU was often debated as a model of supranational governance. And when we have a comparative analysis here, no other intergovernmental organization is quite that extensive as compared to EU. For example, when we look at ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Countries, it has member states. It focuses on promoting economic development, shared expertise, resources. But when we will compare it with EU, the European Union made a huge leap with respect to regional integration by presenting a model wherein there was not only just about common policies on energy and security, but also a unified common currency. Then similarly, the NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was a relic of the Cold War, there was a redefinition, new dynamism was added to the working of alliances also in the post-Cold War era. So what you see here is that global politics, which was primarily seen in sense of a triad explaining the perspectives that were approaches that were used to comprehend global relations. The triads were realism, liberalism, the Marxism. The realism focused on the conflictual and competitive side of global politics. The liberal perspective, which was also known as the idealist, Wilsonianism in IR, focused on that how cooperative avenues are possible in the power struggle and in the global relations. So, whereas Marxism focused on capitalism, the class as a variable of the power struggle of global relations. So in this, the post-Cold War era added a reflectivist perspective. What we find here is that there was new approaches factored in to make better sense of things prevailing and coming up in global politics. For example, the feminist perspective challenges the domination of the status, the power-centric ideas of realism, primarily having a male bias or presenting the perspective in international relations from one side. The new perspectives like constructivism, the challenge that how it is the norms, the ideas that define global politics. So amidst this triad, which was the inter-paradigm debate, as we see in the work of Ole Wyawer, there were three broad guiding perspective: realism, liberalism, Marxism. This was challenged in the post-Cold War era, wherein because the realities of global politics were getting different as compared to what was prevailing at the time of the starting of the Cold War. What you see here is that in post-Cold War era, new non-state actors like non-governmental organizations, or to talk about global social movements working to achieve social change on a global scale, played an important role. To state some very important examples of NGOs and of course doing their contribution for global social movements, Amnesty International, or the idea of better health care, Doctors Without Border, better access to clean water with Rotary International and Water Aid. All of it shows that today, in the realm of global politics, especially in the post-Cold War era, there was a reshaping, reordering, re-emergence of the structure of global relations, wherein state was not the only actor. State coexisted with new actors, and these new actors had an influence on the policy making as well as an influence on the citizens of the nation states. Similarly, in the post-Cold War era, there was an increase in the working and presence of multinational corporations. McDonald's, as we know today, has restaurants in many countries. When we think about Walmart, it can be found all over the world. We can see Ford cars not everywhere in US, Canada, Europe. Similarly, General Motors, it can be seen from a New York to a Shanghai. Airbus, or for that matter, we can see Toyota, Nissan, Honda, all of it in various parts of the globe. So in post-Cold War era, with the rise of globalization, the multinational corporations played an important role as an engine of trade, as an engine of creating more economic avenues and presenting jobs, as well as at the same time the working of MNCs has also been contested primarily from the idea that they presented more harm than good. Nonetheless, an important idea, that is, in post-Cold War era, international relations could not be studied only from the status perspective. International relations demanded a broad horizon because there were new actors that had a bearing on the policy making apparatus. Further, the forces of electronic finance, global markets had an extensive outreach, and wherein the state market discourse, one finds that they had an important bearing on not only domestic policy making but also on the foreign affairs milieu of the nation states. An important stake that we take from the theoretical perspective, Robert Cohen presented a very important perspective to us in differentiation between rationalism and reflectivism. Rational theories somewhere did not give that kind of due significance to the human agency, whereas reflectivist theories, they were more incooperative of change. They were more away from status quo and more incooperative of human agencies. An important work here again, Alexander Wendt, whose extensive work on constructivism is very essential to understand the differentiation in the theoretical narrative in the post-Cold War era. Similarly, what you see here is that there was rise of non-state actors, influential advocacy and civil society organizations, multinational corporations. So the state was no longer enjoying the monopoly of governing the tenor of relations. This was very important for reshaping of the global relations from bipolar to a multipolar world. An important view that has been put forward, and we quote by Joseph Montville, talking about track to diplomacy, a type of diplomacy that does not necessarily involve the state actors. So what's essential to be seen that in post-Cold War relations, global relations witness increasing subnational and non-state interaction, and this subnational and non-state interaction has a bearing on the foreign affairs apparatus for any nation state. International cooperation evidently increased amongst major powers when we look at the extension from G7 to G20, or when we look at the agenda of G20 being extended in the present time from just focus on peace and security to a bigger picture of cooperation on gender, artificial intelligence, sustainability. So therefore, in post-Cold War era, the ambit, the issues wherein which member nation states deal with has been extended. Globalization no doubt benefited many countries and individuals, but at the same time it did bring great risk to that. And this is why today at various diplomatic missions, at various international events, there is a call to reform globalization, put forward the idea of placing people over profits, because the globalization the world saw after the end of the Cold War somewhere was on a very uneven plane. Today, in this post-Cold War world where even globalization is being reimagined, the need for reform, the need to look inwards, augment the domestic strengths, and then have a global leap is being factored in. In the same plane, one also has to see that there were regional conflicts, turmoils and crises not only in the Mediterranean but also in the Caucasus Central Asian region, which is very essential to understand that whether the issues of post-Cold War world somewhere were they better managed or not better managed. So what you see here is that the main challenges for the post-Cold War world, which has a bearing on shaping up the contours of global relations, is global capital, financial stability, asymmetric threats such as international terrorism, regional and transnational conflicts, energy, economy, sustainability, society, humanitarian concerns, pandemics, epidemics. Now, we all know that the world is going through a very turbulent phase wherein there are tectonic shifts. There is a health crisis, which has a bearing and leading towards an economic crisis, and a crisis of institutional legitimacy also. So, therefore, all of it is leading to heightening geopolitical rivalry. And at the same time, taking on and drawing on from the work of Alan Crawford, that is, there is no obvious forum to debate the shape of the post-pandemic world. Now, this is very essential as we draw on from the very recent argument presented by Alan Crawford, that is how a new world order is emerging. And the new world order, dear learners, it's very essential to factor in, it has the same challenges that were there for the world at the time when Cold War ended. So what is essential here is that one has to work on the narrative where the global governance has to be reformed, and at the same time when we are looking at the world that will emerge in post-COVID-19, countries like India have a very important role to play in the new world order, because when we look in the present framework, right from reaching out to every country in terms of presenting help, or right from the beginning how India put forward the need for reforming globalization, and how when the world is going through an ambit wherein there is a trade war rivalry in the post-Cold War world, the nature of warfare changed from a trade war to a biowarfare. Amidst this, with issues of transparency and trust and the need to overhaul the global governance structure, India definitely will have a greater role to play in this new world order, which is very essential and a contemporary perspective on the post-Cold War era and how the world order is being reimagined. Once again, dear learners, thank you for being with us for this lecture. We hope that the lecture presented some significant insights to you on reshaping of global relations, and also how the reshaping of global relations from post-Cold War era today has a bearing and a connect with the times wherein world is witnessing tectonic shifts amidst the pandemics. Thank you for being with us.